one of the wonderful things I love of election time is I feel like there's more issue debate in this period. I think people are more focused, we get more engagement, and it's wonderful. It's a great exercise in democracy. I love it. So one thing I like to do is always see what the opposition is saying. And we've seen with the Liberals and the NDP, there have been a lot of criticisms levied at the Ford government for not doing too much or not funding enough with healthcare during COVID, not enough to help us overcome COVID, or as you've both probably mentioned, that there have been some cracks exposed because of COVID and how we should have cemented those earlier. How much of a role do you really think COVID will play in this election cycle? Do you think, Elliot, you mentioned that you think that maybe there might be fatigue over it and people have kind of moved on. Is that still the sentiment?
I think so. But again, we're going to have to wait and see how the population and the voters react. Look, I think what the Liberals are going to want to try and do is remind voters, and the NDP as well for that matter, remind voters that some of the darker days of COVID, of the pandemic, the inability of the Ford government to get the federal dollars into schools or to get it into the healthcare system, some of the challenges in long-term care homes. Those are the types of things I think that the opposition are going to try and highlight, and the sort of the mismanagement or the failings of management from the Ford government at the time. It was a difficult time to manage, to be in power. I think any government struggled through it in some capacity. I think the opposition parties, to the degree of bringing up COVID, I think that's going to be the lens in which they're going to do it in.
And Yanni, do you think the Ford government could weather that storm? I mean, a wise man once told me that politics is all about, it's the reminding business. You're in the business of reminding people, oh, do you remember that? Do you remember when this happened? And I can see that the opposition's, the two parties will want to remind voters, oh, do you remember, when that report came out damning the actions in the LTCs and the failings there? Do you think Doug Ford and his team are going to have to wear that? And do you think people have just had enough and are ready to move on?
I think Ford recognizes that that people have had enough with COVID and they want to move on. Whether or not he can weather the storm, I think it's going to be a testament to post-pandemic elections at this point. The only election that we've really seen aside from Nova Scotia it has been the federal election, and Justin Trudeau wore the cape really well and represented the fact that, he stood up for Canada during a time of crisis. Now, is Ford going to do the same thing? I certainly think so. I would hope so. But the extent of that, the effect that would have on Ontarians is going to be something that we're going to have to see just on election day.
Now, Yanni, another issue that I could say for the last few election cycles was quite prominent was climate change. What role does it play, what the government response has been, and so on and so forth. There has been some suggestion that, looking at this budget that was just released recently, the Ontario budget, and looking at some of the policies the parties are bringing up, there seems to be not as much being said about climate change. Do you think this is true? And if so, what's your reasoning behind it, do you think?
You know what? I think it's because, the number one issue we saw in the 2021 election was that the number one issue facing Canadians is affordability. I think Canadians are much more concerned about the amount of money that they're paying at the pump to fill up their car with gas to get to and from work or to drop their kids off at school, as opposed to, what measures the government is taking to ensure that oil and gas development in Canada is stifled. I certainly think that, there are, while climate change is certainly an important issue, the number one issue top of mind for myself, for my family, for my parents and friends and others is whether or not they can afford to pay their bills and to be able to put food on the table.
So, Elliot, I'll come to you now. Do you think affordability or other issues for that matter have now eclipsed climate change, and this will be perhaps one of the first elections in recent memory where it will barely get mentioned?
Yeah, it sure feels like it, doesn't it? I mean, affordability seems to be all around us, whether it's the gas prices, whether it's the housing challenges, you name it, it's everywhere. And that makes it difficult for other issues to emerge. I would suggest, though, that this is an opportunity for some leadership. This is a big issue. It's going to continue to be a very big issue. And it's an opportunity for the Liberals and the NDP to seize on that. And I think to drive it home with certain segments of voters that this current Ford government just isn't serious about the environment, isn't serious about climate change, and to really see if they can motivate some of their base, I'm thinking younger people, folks who live in cities, to see that as a really important issue for themselves and for their families. It'll be interesting to see how much the opposition parties are able to talk about it. A lot of the times on campaigns, it's the governing party, what they do, and how the opposition parties react. So if they're not talking about the climate or the environment, it's very difficult for the opposition to make that connection.